In the problem of Atlantis, I think there are a number of points that have not been generally considered. We think of Atlantis as an island, probably somewhere in the Atlantic, and probably about in the location of the present Azores Islands. But actually, Atlantis was a diffusion. If you buy a map now of the world as it is today, we can say that that is the modern distribution. But to have a map of Atlantis as it was in the time of its glory, you would have to have a map of the entire planet, because it was a distribution. Continents rose and fell, islands came up and went down, great land shifts occurred, and the Atlantic distribution of land was far more important and far more far-reaching than the mere problem of an island somewhere in the ocean. So we have to think of Atlantis in relationship to a complete pattern of the planet. As Plato clearly points out, the island of Poseidonis, which we now think of as Atlantis, was the last fragment of a great empire. It is the last surviving part, and is supposed to have disappeared under the ocean about 12,000 years before the Trojan War, which would make it about 15,000 years ago. Now, in connection with the problem of Atlantis, I think the next thing we have to study is the name. Plato refers to the mysterious empire as Atlantis. He probably received this name, or secured it, from Solon, who in turn had received it from the priests of the Egyptian temple at Sais. Now, the word Atlantis, or its root, is not Egyptian, and it is not Greek. No one seems to be able to trace the origin of the name. It appears on two very important phases of ancient mythology, Atlantis and Atlas. And the root is ATL, Atal. Now, if we look to find a language in which that word or that root is permissible or was used, we find you'd have to come to the Western Hemisphere, because Atal was one of the month names of the Mayas. It also has more than just a name significance. Its glyph, or its symbol, is a deluge. This seems then to give us the real basis of our word, that we are dealing with a term that represents a world experience, that various countries were involved in it, that the circumstances were known around the entire planet, and that the name that has survived to us today is probably based upon the records on the Western Hemisphere. Now, if we take the general term to represent this mysterious region, we then can find from the Codex Troano, which is in the museum in Madrid, one of the surviving documents of the Mayas, that this particular deluge is marked in the glyphs of the people. The story is told in pictures, but among these pictures there is one in which the sky dragon, or the sky serpent, is pouring water from its mouth, and below this the god of death is dancing on the earth. Now, this was a long time ago, long before the coming of the Spaniards, but the records even go much further than that. According to the Chinese, the previous existence before our present coming to this earth was destroyed. The previous world was destroyed by water, a tremendous deluge. And in the I Ching, the 8 trigrams, basic trigrams, correspond to Noah and his wife, their 3 sons and their 3 wives, were the 8 who were saved. And this is exactly what the Chinese tell us. So the story goes around here and there and everywhere. It's a very interesting story, but what does it really mean? Is it merely an archaeological curiosity, or does it have some dynamic value for us today? I would like to think of Atlantis much as Lord Bacon did in his book, The New Atlantis, in which he says in very simple terms, the New Atlantis, which is America. Bacon was quite convinced that on the Western Hemisphere a great empire would arise, an empire that would surpass the glory of the Atlantean story, and that this new world would not be destroyed. It would not turn against the gods. It would not misuse the energies of nature, and as a result would become a new world, a restoration of the Golden Age. Now, when we study this Atlantean problem a little more carefully, we realize there have been a number of speculations on this. Vice President Dawes made quite an extensive search for the Atlantean world. A number of good archaeologists and ethnologists have devoted time to it. And the general attitude is no longer to discard it as a fable, but to try to find out what its actual meaning could be. Now let us suppose that Solon was correct, and that Solon, being an old man, was unable to do what he had intended to do, and that was to write out an account of the lost Atlantis as he found it, or it was given to him, in the caves under the Temple of Sais in Egypt. Here on columns formed of orichalcum, a metal that cannot perish, was recorded the story of a lost world. These two tablets are sometimes referred to as the Tables of Enoch, and we find a great deal of mystical lore surrounding this story. In any event, Solon, being very old and unable to carry on the work, passed the legend on to one of his descendants who was a student of Plato's. And this student, in turn, told Plato, who took the story, to use it as a great symbolical account of the descent of man. Now, Plato does not deny that the story is literally true, but he does point out so many very subtle and unusual details that we are forced to realize